Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages. You might want to dim the lights, maybe get a blanket, and let's take a quiet walk through history's pettiest mistakes. Because, as it turns out, a surprising number of medieval laws and bans came into existence not because of reason, or morality, or public safety, but because one person, somewhere, did something so monumentally foolish that the rest of society decided no one should ever be allowed to try it again. So tonight, we're not talking about knights or battles. We're talking about bans. The strange, stubborn, sometimes hilarious ways medieval people decided that one bad idea was enough to outlaw something forever. Let's start with one of my favorites, the time a single knight ruined jousting for everyone. The knight who made jousting illegal temporarily. In the 12th and 13th centuries, jousting was the thing. Imagine a mix of sport, status, and pure masculine delusion that was jousting. Two armored men galloping at full speed, with the express goal of knocking each other into the dirt, while the crowd cheered. It was glorious. It was dangerous. And for a brief moment, it was banned because one man simply couldn't behave. That man was Henry II of England, though technically he was the banning party, not the fool in question. The fool was one of his knights, a fellow who decided that jousting near the royal court was the perfect way to impress people. Unfortunately, he managed to kill not just his opponent, but also a spectator. And, according to chroniclers, a horse that happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naturally, Henry was horrified, or perhaps just annoyed that people kept dying on his lawn. So, in a move that must have disappointed thousands of wannabe gallant men, he declared jousting forbidden throughout England. No tournaments, no glory, no excuses. All because one man took the phrase knight in shining armor a bit too literally and turned it into knight in court-ordered timeout. Of course, the ban didn't last, because knights were, if nothing else, persistent. By the time of his son, King Richard the Lionheart, jousting was back, complete with regulation lists, rules, and the faint hope that maybe fewer people would die this time. They didn't, but it's the thought that counts. The monk who got singing banned now, drifting away from the clatter of lances and armor. Let's visit a quiet monastery. Monks, as you know, were supposed to be paragons of discipline and serenity. They prayed, copied manuscripts, and generally avoided excitement. Except, of course, for Brother Geoffrey. There's always one Geoffrey in the late medieval period. Some monasteries allowed music during meals, gentle chanting, sacred hymns. A bit of atmosphere, you know. Until Brother Geoffrey decided that if chanting was good, solo performance was better. He apparently took to embellishing his chants with improvised notes and theatrical gestures. What later sources described as vain flourishes and prideful melody, in modern terms. Imagine Gregorian karaoke. The abbot, unsurprisingly, was not amused. He banned all singing at meals for every monk in the monastery, because one man couldn't resist showing off. The incident spread, as these things do, and similar bans appeared elsewhere. It seems the medieval church's greatest fear was not sin itself, but someone having a little too much fun while sinning. So, thanks to Brother Geoffrey's enthusiasm, centuries of monks had to eat their gruel in contemplative silence. No soundtrack allowed. The noble woman who ruined read die next. Let's glide over to France, to a noblewoman named Isabeau, living in the 14th century. She adored fashion. Specifically, she adored red, the bright, almost glowing scarlet that was made from crushed cochineal insects and rare dyes imported at great cost. Wearing it was a statement. It said, "I am rich enough to stain things with bugs." But one fateful day, Isabeau wore a new red gown to a royal feast. It was spectacular. It was also allegedly still slightly damp from the dyeing process. As she sat down on a fine white velvet cushion belonging to the Duchess of Burgundy, the damp red pigment bled everywhere. When she stood up, she left behind what one chronicler described as a stain of such magnitude that laughter did fill the hall. Humiliation followed. The Duchess demanded repayment for the ruined cushion, and court gossip turned merciless. Soon after, the king perhaps, tired of hearing about upholstery scandals, issued a temporary ban on unfixed red garments in court. One woman's laundry mishap had turned into national legislation. Naturally, the rule didn't last forever. But for a brief, shining moment, the Kingdom of France outlawed wet clothes. The peasant who made crossbows controversial now. Let's drift to something a little sharper. The crossbow, that marvelous, terrible invention that made killing people much easier for those who couldn't afford a suit of armor. It was the great equalizer, and naturally, that made nobles very nervous. One story goes that in the early 1100s, a French peasant, unnamed, probably wisely used a crossbow to shoot a local baron in the leg over a tax dispute. The wound became infected, and the baron died. And just like that, the crossbow was no longer a useful innovation. It was a peasant's weapon. The church quickly condemned it. Pope Innocent II declared that crossbows should never be used against Christians, only heathens, which is, admittedly, a fascinating loophole. Of course, everyone ignored the rule almost immediately, because if you tell a medieval knight not to use the best killing tool available, he'll probably just nod politely and do it anyway. But for a while, the humble crossbow was treated as a scandalous, dishonorable, and deeply unfair device. All because one angry farmer decided he'd had enough of paying taxes. The king who ruined mustaches. Let's not pretend they weren't important. Facial hair, in the Middle Ages, was not just a style choice. It was politics. And occasionally, personal revenge. Enter King Peter of Castile, 14th century. He was called Peter the Cruel, though honestly, that was probably generous. After losing a heated argument with a noble who mocked his thin, patchy moustache, Peter decided to issue a royal decree forbidding all courtiers from wearing long or curled moustaches, the very kind he couldn't grow. Petty. Absolutely. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. Chroniclers recorded that for several years. The Castilian court was full of miserable, freshly shaven men, all pretending it was a new fashion. The ban only ended after Peter's assassination. The new king immediately restored the right to grow facial hair, possibly as a first act of mercy, and so, history remembers Peter the Cruel not for his conquests or reforms, but for banning mustaches out of pure spite. The queen who got chess ban moving north for a moment. Let's talk about Queen Margaret of Norway. 13th century. Chess was the intellectual sport of the medieval elite, a game of patience, logic, and mild resentment. But in Margaret's court, it became something else entirely, a public spectacle of humiliation. One evening, her husband, King Haakon, made the mistake of beating her 3 times in a row. He reportedly made some comment about a woman's place on the board, which, if true, might have been his final error. The queen, red-faced and furious, hurled the entire chessboard across the room. Unfortunately, medieval chess sets were made of solid wood. The king was hit in the head, and a royal physician had to be called the next day. In what we can only imagine was a tense breakfast meeting, Margaret declared chess a source of discord and unseemly strife, and banned it from the royal household. Incredibly, the ban spread to other Scandinavian courts for a time, under the assumption that if Norway can't handle chess, perhaps no one can. And that's how one bad game turned into a kingdom-wide timeout. The monk who ended scented candles, sort of. You might think scented candles are a modern indulgence, but medieval monasteries occasionally used perfumed tallow candles mixed with herbs or resin, especially during winter vigils, when the smell of damp wool could be overwhelming. Then came Brother Anselm. He had the bright idea to make his own experimental blend using cinnamon oil. Unfortunately, cinnamon oil is highly flammable. His candle burned beautifully for about 3 minutes, before turning into a small inferno that destroyed part of the scriptorium. Asterisk. The abbot, understandably, decided that perhaps God preferred the natural smell of tallow after all. From that day, no monk in the abbey was allowed to use scented candles again. Some say this rule persisted for nearly a century, all because one man's attempt at cozy lighting ended in divine barbecue. The baker who ruined gingerbread menand finally. For this part of our sleepy journey, we arrive in 16th century England, a bit late for the Middle Ages, but close enough in spirit. Gingerbread was a royal favorite. It was sweet, fragrant, and often shaped into little figures, kings, saints, or hearts. At least, until one ambitious baker in the court of Queen Elizabeth I decided to make gingerbread portraits of actual living nobles. It was meant to be flattering. It was not. He handed them out at a feast, where guests were expected to eat their own likenesses. Apparently, one man refused, saying it was unlucky to devour one's own image. Another guest accidentally bit the head off a depiction of a bishop in full view of the bishop. Within days, someone complained to the Queen that the custom was idolatrous and morbid. And just like that, edible human-shaped cookies were banned from court feasts, of course. Centuries later, gingerbread men made a triumphant return. But for a long while, England had officially outlawed eating your friends in biscuit form. And that, I think, is enough bans for one night, or at least for one chapter of our slow drift through medieval nonsense. We've seen kings outlaw sports, queens ban games, monks ruin candles, and nobles outlaw the color red, all because one person just went too far. But there are many more examples where one royal's personal grudge reshaped entire nations. So as we settle further into the dark, candlelit absurdity of medieval Europe, let's drift next to those unfortunate souls whose personal habits, not just accidents, led to some of the strangest laws ever written. Asterisk. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to ancient Greece. You might want to dim the lights, take a slow breath, and get comfortable, maybe with a blanket, maybe with that cup of tea that's probably gone cold by now. We're going to a place where relaxation was not especially valued, a place where children were trained to run, fight, and endure hardship before they even learned how to properly sit still. Yes, tonight we're drifting to Sparta, but not to the men, not to the warriors who shouted and marched and occasionally yelled. This is Sparta in badly remembered movie quotes. No, tonight we're looking at the other half of that famously grim society, the Spartan women, specifically, the upbringing of Spartan girls. Because while most of the ancient world was busy locking women in rooms and pretending they didn't exist, Sparta decided to raise them like athletes, philosophers, and, occasionally, small, terrifying military commanders in linen, tunics. So let's drift into that peculiar contradiction. The Spartan girlhood that was freer than almost anywhere else in Greece, and yet somehow still entirely about serving the state. A society built on other people's labor before we meet the girls themselves. It's worth remembering that Sparta was built on an enormous, unspoken system of servitude. For every free Spartan, there were at least 7 enslaved helots. The local population forced to farm and labor so that Spartan citizens could devote themselves entirely to military life. So, when a Spartan girl was born into the upper class, one of the Spartiates, she was born into a society that expected her to do absolutely nothing except produce more Spartans. She would never have to weave, or grind grain, or fetch water. Those things were considered beneath her, not because they were bad, but because they were inefficient. Spartan ideology demanded perfection in every citizen, and citizen meant someone whose body exists to strengthen the state. That included the women. They didn't fight in wars, but they were trained as if they might, because the logic went that only strong women could give birth to strong men. So, in a sense, every Spartan girl was raised like an athlete. For the sake of her hypothetical future children, childhood, less dollhouse, more gymnasium in most of Greece, girls were expected to stay indoors, quiet, obedient, learning to spin wool and avoid eye contact. In Sparta, that was considered absurd. From around the age of 7, Spartan girls trained daily, running, wrestling, javelin throwing, even boxing. They exercised in public, often wearing short tunics that scandalized visiting Athenians. The Athenians, whose ideal woman was invisible and silent, were horrified by Spartan girls. One visitor wrote that they were bold of speech and bare of limb, which, in ancient Greek terms, was roughly the same as calling someone a rock star. Spartan girls raced along dusty fields, threw spears farther than some boys, and were praised for their strength. They were expected to eat well, to build muscle, and to shout if they needed something. In other words, the complete opposite of what most Greek fathers wanted in a daughter. It's tempting to see this as feminist, and in some ways, yes, it was revolutionary. But it wasn't about equality. It was about efficiency. The state believed that tough, healthy women would bear tough, healthy soldiers. So the girls trained, not for themselves, but for Sparta still. They probably enjoyed the running more than embroidery, education, and the art of saying things. Out loud Spartan girls also received formal education, something almost unheard of elsewhere in Greece. They learned reading, writing, music, and poetry. But unlike in Athens, where poetry was meant to make you cultured and delicate, Spartan poetry was often military propaganda set to a beat. Girls would chant verses about bravery, loyalty, and dying gloriously for the homeland, which must have made for some truly strange lullabies. They also practiced public speaking. A Spartan woman was expected to have an opinion and to state it clearly. When a foreign woman once asked a Spartan, "Why are your women the only ones who rule their men?" the Spartan replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." You have to respect the confidence. Spartan women weren't passive. They were trained to argue, to command, to take control of estates when their husbands were at war, which was most of the time. They ran the farms, managed finances, and even owned land, which was rare in Greece, By the 4th century BCE, Spartan women reportedly owned nearly 40% of all property in the state. That's not just influence. That's a quiet economic coup, asterisk marriage, or something like it now. If you're imagining a romantic Spartan wedding with flowers and poetry and awkward dancing, marriage in Sparta was more like an endurance test with paperwork. Girls typically married around 18, which, for ancient Greece, was refreshingly adult. Elsewhere, girls were married off at 13 or 14, usually 2 men twice their age, but Spartan women were expected to grow strong first, to mature physically before bearing children. Their husbands, meanwhile, continued to live in military barracks until age 30, visiting home only in secret. Plutarch tells us that sometimes the groom would sneak into his own marriage bed at night, in the dark, and then quietly slip back to the barracks by dawn. This, apparently, was meant to make the relationship fresh and exciting. It also sounds like the plot of an oddly repressed romantic comedy. If they were caught spending too much time together, they could be reprimanded, not for moral reasons, but because love was considered a distraction from duty. Sparta didn't want passionate husbands. It wanted obedient soldiers who happened to have children. The state as a third parent, the most unnerving part of Spartan childhood wasn't the discipline or the training. It was how completely the state replaced the family. For boys, this was explicit. They were taken from their parents at 7 and raised in military dormitories. Girls stayed home, but the ideology was the same. Their mothers weren't raising daughters. They were raising future mothers of soldiers. Women were told their highest virtue was to give birth to brave sons, and if those sons died heroically, they were expected to be proud. Asterisk. According to tradition, Spartan mothers handed their sons their shields before battle and said, "Come back with it," or "on it," which sounds poetic until you realize it was literal. Come back victorious or dead. No pressure. Even in death, the rules were strict. In Sparta, only 2 kinds of people received inscribed gravestones: men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth, because both had served the state. It's a striking kind of equality, grim, symmetrical, and completely utilitarian. Food, fitness, and the fine art of not being fat. One of the strangest Spartan customs concerned diet. While most Greek women were expected to eat daintily small portions, soft food, Spartan girls were given hearty meals of barley, cheese, figs, and meat, because again, strength mattered. A pale, delicate woman was an Athenian ideal, a Spartan one. She was expected to look like she could throw a discus and her husband. This caused endless mockery from outsiders. Athenian playwrights loved to depict Spartan women as loud, muscular, and terrifying, a sort of ancient stereotype of the unladylike woman. They imagined them marching around, shouting at men, and wrestling in the nude, which, to be fair, they sometimes did. But to Spartans, physical beauty was linked to vitality. They believed that health radiated outward, that strong bodies meant strong offspring. So a fit, sunburned Spartan woman was considered far more beautiful than a perfumed, pale one hiding behind curtains in Athens. Songs, festivals, and the occasional insult competition for all their rigidity. The Spartans did enjoy public festivals, often involving choral performances by young women. These weren't gentle recitals. They were competitive, athletic displays, with girls singing and dancing before the assembled men. Sometimes, the songs included playful insults toward the bachelors in the audience. Spartan maidens would taunt unmarried men, calling them lazy or cowardly, which was probably very motivating. Imagine being publicly roasted by a chorus of teenage athletes in front of your peers. Spartan peer pressure was a national sport, and these festivals served a deeper purpose. They reinforced social hierarchy, tested discipline, and though no one said it aloud, acted as a kind of public matchmaking showcase. The ideal Spartan girl wasn't just strong. She was confident, articulate, and fearless enough to mock a man to his face. No wonder Athenian visitors found the whole thing unsettling. Pregnancy and the pursuit of perfect babies. When a Spartan woman finally did have children, her job was far from over. She was expected to produce not just any child, but an ideal one. Newborns were examined by the elders of the tribe. If the baby looked weak, it could be left to die, not out of cruelty, they claimed, but out of civic duty. Sparta couldn't afford weak citizens. This was eugenics before the word existed, and Spartan mothers were raised to accept it. They were taught that the state's needs came before their own emotions. Still, many Spartan women were fiercely proud of their children's strength and discipline. There are records of mothers publicly celebrating sons who died heroically in battle, not weeping, but standing tall in the marketplace, as if grief were unpatriotic. To modern ears, it sounds chilling, but within the walls of Sparta, it was the highest form of love, love that served the state, the paradox of power. And so we're left with this contradiction. Spartan women were, in many ways, the most liberated in Greece. They could own land, run businesses, speak their minds, and train their bodies. Yet everything they did was directed toward one narrow purpose: producing soldiers for an endless war machine, freedom without self-determination, empowerment without choice. Even in later centuries, when Sparta's population declined and wealth concentrated among its women, the ideology remained the same. A Spartan woman could rule her household, but she belonged to the state. It's a strange kind of power, impressive, unsettling, and, somehow, still relevant today. The idea that women can be respected for their strength, but only when it benefits the system around them. So tonight, as we drift away from the echo of marching feet and the sound of chanting girls in white linen, it's worth remembering that Spartan girlhood was both enviable and tragic. It promised strength, but never softness, independence, but never escape. They were, in a way, the perfect citizens of an imperfect world. Let's drift, then, to the next part of our sleepy history, to another society where childhood was treated less as a blessing and more as a public project. Asterisk, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Ottoman Empire. You can go ahead and dim the lights, maybe settle under a blanket. This is one of those stories best heard when you're half asleep. Halfway between history and dream, we're stepping into the world of the imperial harem, not the fantasy version, with incense and pillows and suspiciously good lighting, but the real one. The quiet, controlled, politically charged institution that raised, trained, and occasionally destroyed some of the most powerful women in the empire, because, as it turns out, the Ottoman harem wasn't a playground. It was a machine. A layered, disciplined, and carefully ranked system, a bureaucracy of beauty and obedience, designed not for pleasure, but for power, and at its heart was a ladder that thousands of women tried to climb, one polished marble step at a time. The myth and the reality. When Western visitors first wrote about the Ottoman harem, they described it as something between paradise and prison. a place filled with exotic women lounging idly while awaiting the Sultan's affection. Naturally, they were wrong. They usually were. The imperial harem, Topkapi harem, in particular, was less of a pleasure palace and more of a highly structured institution. Imagine a convent, a finishing school, and a royal court, all in one enclosed marble labyrinth. It was the center of domestic politics in the Ottoman world. Every alliance, every succession, every whisper of scandal, all of it, passed through the women's quarters before reaching the Sultan's ear, and at the top of this glittering hierarchy sat a handful of women who ruled not through armies, but through silk, strategy, and silence. The sultanas and the slaves. Most women in the harem weren't noble. They weren't even free. The majority were enslaved girls, taken from across the empire, from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and beyond. They were brought in young, sometimes as children, and trained for years. They learned languages, music, manners, calligraphy, and the art of survival, which was perhaps the most important subject of all. They weren't treated as common slaves. Once inside the imperial harem, they belonged not to a person, but to the state. Their purpose was to serve the dynasty, and their rank determined everything. From where they slept to what kind of jewels they were allowed to wear, the very lowest ranks started in obscurity. But the system was designed to be flexible. A girl could, in theory, rise to become the mother of a future sultan. And in a world where most women were invisible, that was a kind of immortality. The Khalfa and the Usta, the working women of the haremlet, start near the bottom of this gentle pyramid. At the lowest rung were the Asimi girls, the new arrivals. They were given new names, new clothes, and a strict education. They scrubbed floors, served food, and learned to move quietly. Their silence was part of their training. After years of service, some were promoted to Khalfa, skilled attendants. They managed the logistics of the harem, the linen, the laundry, the endless candles that had to be replaced each evening. They were the backbone of the household. Above them stood the Usta, or masters, the senior servants who oversaw entire sections of the harem. They enforced discipline, arranged schedules, and handled disputes. If the harem was a city, the Usta were the mayors of its tiny neighborhoods. Most women would remain at this level forever. They would grow old within the same walls, perhaps mentoring younger girls, perhaps fading quietly into the rhythm of palace life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe, and in a world that offered women few guarantees, safety was its own luxury. The Adolik, the Sultan's attendants from among the trained girls. A few were chosen to become Odalikler, or personal attendants to the Sultan. Despite the romantic stories, this didn't mean they immediately shared his bed. Most Odalikler served, practically pouring coffee, arranging robes, helping him dress for audiences. They were background figures, always present, but rarely noticed. If the Sultan happened to notice one, really notice her, she could be promoted to a favored concubine. And that was when life began to change. Asterisk. The Iqbal, the favored ones, becoming an Iqbal, literally, fortunate one, was every harem girl's dream. It meant she had caught the Sultan's attention. Maybe it was her grace, her wit, or simply the right glance at the right time. Iqbals lived in private chambers, wore finer clothes, and had personal servants. They received an allowance, gifts, and, most importantly, a degree of safety. But their position was fragile. An Iqbal could rise swiftly or vanish just as easily. If she failed to keep the Sultan's interest, she could be quietly reassigned to distant quarters or married off to a minor official. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes audition that never really ended. Still, if she was lucky enough to bear the Sultan a child, especially a son, everything changed. Again, the Khaden, the official consorts, when a concubine gave birth to a child, she was elevated to the rank of Khaden, the Sultan's consort. There were usually 4 of them, though the number varied. Each Khaden had her own apartments, her own servants, and crucially, her own political influence. The order of seniority was determined by the Sultan's affection and the birth order of their children. The Baskedin, or first consort, was effectively the queen in all but name. These women were not legally wives. Ottoman sultans rarely married after the 15th century, because marriage implied alliance with a particular family, and that was dangerous. Concubines, by contrast, came from nowhere. They had no outside loyalties, no powerful fathers, no brothers demanding favors in a way. The harem was designed to keep politics contained, even as it quietly created its own. The Haseki Sultan, the sultan's favoritationally, one woman rose above all the others. She became the Haseki Sultan, the sultan's chief consort and public favorite. The title meant she who shares the sultan's fortune. The most famous was Harem Sultan, better known in the West as Roxolana, a girl of Ruthenian origin, who rose from slavery to become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Harem was clever, literate, and utterly unafraid of playing politics. She corresponded with foreign rulers, commissioned mosques, and influenced imperial policy, all while technically living behind walls. Her rise changed the entire Ottoman system. After her, sultans began to rely more heavily on their consorts and mothers for counsel. It was the dawn of what historians call the Sultanate of Women. A century and a half when the real power behind the Ottoman throne often wore embroidered slippers. The Valid Sultan, the mother of the empire, the top of the harem. Hierarchy stood one woman above all others, the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. If the harem was a court within a court, the Valid was its empress. She had her own apartments, servants, and income. She corresponded with viziers, received ambassadors, and oversaw the education of her grandchildren. Her word carried weight, often more than that of the Grand Vizier himself. When a new sultan ascended, his mother's position became unassailable. She controlled access to her son, and thus to the state. Sometimes she used this power benevolently, mediating disputes, funding charities, commissioning fountains and schools. Other times she used it ruthlessly. More than one vizier found his career abruptly ended by a Valid's quiet disapproval. They were the empire's silent architects, shaping policy through whispers and gifts. And while the men of the Ottoman court waged wars for glory, the women of the harem waged wars for survival. Eunuchs and ordino harem could function. Without its guards, the eunuchs, the chief among them was the Kisla Aka, the black eunuch of the palace. He controlled the physical gates of the harem, and by extension, its flow of information. If the Valid Sultan was the voice of the harem, the Kisla Aka was its gatekeeper. He could make or unmake a career simply by choosing whom to let through a door. And although he was technically a servant, his influence extended deep into the politics of the empire. In a way, the harem was its own miniature government, with ministers, departments, and an unspoken constitution. Everything ran on hierarchy, loyalty, and the constant, delicate balance between affection and ambition. A world of rituals and rules inside those walls. Every detail mattered. When to bow, when to speak, which direction to face when greeting a superior. The daily life of the harem followed strict patterns: prayers, lessons, meals, music, and inspections. Punishments were rare but severe: a demotion, loss of privileges, or reassignment to menial labor. But beneath the rules, there was a strange kind of serenity. The marble floors, the echoing courtyards, the scent of rosewater and ink. For many women, it was the safest place they'd ever lived. A cage, yes, but a gilded one, and a predictable one. Outside those walls was uncertainty. Inside, at least, there was order. The illusion of isolation from the outside. It seemed that the harem was sealed off from the world. But in truth, it was deeply connected to it. The women influenced art, architecture, and even diplomacy. Letters from Haseki sultans to European queens survive, written in polished Ottoman Turkish, full of delicate phrasing and firm political undertones. The valid sultans sponsored mosques and charities throughout the empire, their names inscribed on fountains and schools. In Istanbul, you can still walk through neighborhoods shaped by their endowments, places built by women who never walked the city's streets. Their power was invisible, but enduring. A kind of quiet empire within an empire. The fall of the harem's power by the 19th century. The old system began to unravel. The empire was modernizing, and the harem, once a symbol of refinement, came to represent backwardness in European eyes. Sultans began to live more publicly, and their mothers and consorts faded into ceremonial roles. The last powerful, valid sultans died with the empire's decline, their world collapsing into memory. When the Ottoman dynasty was finally abolished in 1922, the harem was dissolved. The gates were opened, the rooms emptied, and for the first time in centuries, the palace fell silent, but their legacy lingered in architecture, in politics, and in the strange, contradictory stories of women who wielded immense power from behind screens. So tonight, as we drift away from the marble halls of Topkapi, from the rustle of silk slippers and the quiet echo of whispered schemes, it's worth remembering that the Ottoman harem was not a fairy tale of submission. It was a world of structure, ambition, and control. A place where women learned that survival could be its own kind of sovereignty, and sometimes that was more than enough. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before maps were trustworthy and before people realized that Here Be Dragons was not, in fact, a useful piece of cartography. Settle in, dim the lights, maybe make yourself a cup of tea that's a little too hot to drink right now, so you can forget about it halfway through and find it cold later, like an artifact of your own negligence, because tonight we're going on a long, slow journey across deserts, over mountains, and through centuries of confusion, following the life of one of history's most famous travelers, Marco Polo, a man whose name became shorthand for exploration, and later for shouting at friends in swimming pools, an evolution of legacy he probably wouldn't have appreciated. A Venetian beginning, Marco Polo was born in 1254. In Venice, a city that even back then was more water than land and more commerce than conscience. Venice wasn't quite Italy as we know it today. It was its own mercantile empire, floating on trade, salt, and mild arrogance. If there was gold to be found, silk to be bought, or spices to be marked up by 400%, a Venetian merchant was already there, probably explaining why it wasn't really that expensive. If you think about it, Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle Maffeo were both merchants. They specialized in long-distance trade, which, in the 13th century, mostly meant trying not to die of scurvy before you made it home. By the time Marco was born, his father had already left Venice on a trading mission. In fact, he wouldn't return until Marco was about 15 years old, which means Marco spent his childhood learning the art of waiting, a skill that would come in handy later. When your travel time is measured in years, the family reunion that changed history when Niccolo finally returned to Venice around 1269. He brought news that seemed half mythical. He and his brother had reached the court of a man called Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the vast Mongol Empire. The Khan had been very interested in these oddly dressed men from the far-off west. He gave them a letter for the Pope, asking for 100 learned men to come east and teach Christianity, science, and whatever else Europeans thought made them sound clever at dinner parties. The Polos, sensing an opportunity, decided to go back. And this time, they brought young Marco along, because nothing says family bonding quite like a multi-year trek across medieval Asia, setting out the long road east *. In 1271, Marco Polo was 17. While most European teenagers were busy learning swordplay or Latin verbs they'd never use, Marco packed his belongings for a trip that would take him more than 15,000 miles from home. He, his father, and his uncle traveled first to Acre, in modern-day Israel, to meet with the papal legate, because they still needed those 100 learned men the Khan had requested. Unfortunately, the church was, as usual, in the middle of a bureaucratic crisis. There was no pope at the moment, the position was vacant, so the Polos waited round awkwardly until a new one was elected. Eventually, Pope Gregory VI gave them 2 friars to take east with them. But as soon as the group reached dangerous territory, the friars decided that martyrdom sounded much less appealing in practice, and turned back. So the Polos continued, alone, 3 Venetians, a handful of servants, and enough optimism to qualify as delusion. Across the Middle East and Persia, their route took them through Armenia, Persia, and the Pamirs, which Marco later described as so high that even the birds could not fly over them. That's an exaggeration, of course. Birds are famously good at flying, but it gives you a sense of how difficult the journey was. They crossed deserts where water was rare, mountains where air was thin, and kingdoms where hospitality was often conditional on your ability to pay for it. Marco, still barely an adult, was taking everything in. He learned languages, recorded customs, and apparently had the kind of memory that made him dangerous in arguments. Later, by the time they reached the borders of the Mongol Empire, he'd absorbed enough detail to one day write one of the strangest travel books ever produced, Arrival at the Court of Kublai Khan around 1275. After nearly 4 years on the road, the Polos reached Kublai Khan's court, probably at Shangdu, also known to later poets as Xanadu, which, incidentally, was not a disco. Kublai Khan was already in his 70s, ruling an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. He was curious about everything foreign, religion, trade, and especially gadgets. If it clicked, clanged, or made light, he wanted to see it. When the Polos presented him with their gifts and letters from the Pope, Kublai was reportedly delighted. He questioned Marco about Europe, and, for reasons no one fully understands, took an immediate liking to him. Maybe it was Marco's enthusiasm. Maybe it was the novelty of someone who didn't try to conquer him. Whatever the reason, Marco soon became a favorite at court. Marco, the administrator, and, like most European travelers, Marco wasn't just sightseeing. Kublai Khan actually gave him real jobs, something few backpackers can claim. Marco served as an administrator, an envoy, and possibly a tax inspector in various parts of the empire. He learned Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, and bits of other regional languages. He traveled as far as Yunnan, near modern-day Burma, and possibly even to the coast of present-day Vietnam. He described the wealth of Chinese cities with near religious awe, especially Hangzhou, which he claimed was the most splendid city in the world. It had, according to Marco, 12,000 bridges, a number that, while poetic, might have been slightly exaggerated. He was fascinated by paper money, coal, and the efficient postal system, all things Europe would take centuries to catch up on. But perhaps his greatest skill was simply observation. He paid attention to things that others ignored, from silk production to the taste of Mongolian wine, and he remembered it all. The court of contradictions life at Kublai Khan's court was a strange blend of luxury and exhaustion. There were banquets with hundreds of dishes, armies of servants, and hunting expeditions that lasted months. Kublai himself was a mix of philosopher and despot, intelligent, curious, and occasionally terrifying. He could quote Confucius one moment and order a massacre the next, a sort of medieval example of complex leadership style. Marco seemed genuinely fond of him, though describing the Khan with admiration that bordered on hero worship. And perhaps that was understandable. Kublai Khan represented the pinnacle of power and culture in a world that, from Europe's perspective, barely existed. It's easy to forget how small the European worldview was in the 13th century. Marco had effectively stepped off the edge of their mental map and found it full of cities, palaces, and bureaucrats who did paperwork better than the Venetians, which, frankly, must have been alarming. 17 years in the East. The Polos stayed in the Mongol Empire for about 17 years. That's long enough to forget what your home looks like, and to develop strong opinions about Mongolian cuisine. During this time, Marco continued to serve as an envoy, traveling across China, observing trade routes, and noting down details that would later confuse European readers. For centuries he claimed to have governed a city for 3 years, possibly, and though historians still debate whether that part was true or just a translation error multiplied by storytelling enthusiasm. What's certain is that Marco became deeply familiar with the inner workings of the empire, from the organization of the postal system to the way salt taxes funded government projects. And unlike most travelers, he survived to tell the tale. The long road home. By 1291, the Polos were homesick. They'd spent nearly 2 decades in service to the Great Khan, and were probably ready for a change of cuisine. Kublai Khan, by this point, was old and reluctant to let them go. He only allowed their departure when they volunteered to escort a Mongol princess to Persia, a 20,000-mile detour that somehow counted as on the way. The journey was disastrous. They traveled by sea, and of the several hundred people who started the voyage, only a handful survived, including the Polos. The princess, miraculously, did too by the time they reached Venice again in 1295. Marco was 41 years old and almost unrecognizable. His clothes were foreign, his manners strange, and his luggage full of jewels sewn into hidden seams. Venice, naturally, didn't believe a word of his story. Asterisk, the prison book deals. Soon after returning home, Marco got caught up in a war between Venice and Genoa, because nothing says welcome back like being immediately imprisoned in 1298. He found himself in a Genoese jail cell, where he met a man named Rustichello of Pisa, a professional writer of romances and adventure tales. With little else to do, Marco began dictating his travels. Rustichello wrote them down in a mixture of Italian and French, under the modest title The Description of the World, or, as it later became known, The Travels of Marco Polo. It was part travelogue, part fantasy, part corporate report. It described lands most Europeans didn't know existed, populated by people who sounded half human, half fable. Readers were fascinated and skeptical, because when a Venetian merchant starts talking about paper money, black stones that burn, and cities with 1 million people, you might think he's had too much sea air. Still, the book spread across Europe. It became one of the most influential travel accounts in history, shaping how the West imagined Asia for centuries. Even Christopher Columbus carried a copy, filled with handwritten notes, which goes to show how far misinformation can travel when it's written elegantly. The later years after his release, Marco returned to Venice, married a woman named Annata Bador, and had 3 daughters. He lived quietly, managing his wealth and occasionally reminding people that, yes, he really had met Kubla Khan. When he died in 1324, he was about 70 years old. According to legend, a priest urged him to confess that his stories were exaggerated. Marco reportedly replied, "I did not tell half of what I saw." It's a line that historians both admire and roll their eyes at, because of course he said that. If there was one thing Marco understood, it was marketing. The legacy of a traveler. Marco Polo's greatest journey may not have been the one he took, but the one his readers imagined. His book expanded Europe's mental map, turning myth into geography, and sometimes geography back into myth again. Asterisk. It inspired centuries of exploration, misunderstanding, and cultural fascination. Even today, his name lingers attached to hotels, airports, and tragically, a pool game that has nothing to do with Asia. But perhaps that's fitting. After all, Marco Polo's journey was always about the distance between what's real and what's remembered, the hazy twilight between fact and story, where history slowly falls asleep. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the long road stretching eastward, the clinking of camel bells, the glow of desert fires, the slow rhythm of travel beneath a sky too large for maps, because, once upon a time, a young Venetian followed that path, and the world never quite looked the same again. Asterisk.